Okay. I'm going to go ahead and call the council work session to order. Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Alderman Matthey,
Here.
Alderman Sage,
Here.
Alderman Malamoy, Alderman Burgess,
Here.
Alderman Painter,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Schmidt,
Here.
Alderman Black, Alderman Hallman,
Here.
Alderman Bray,
Here.
Mayor Renner.
Mayor Renner is away today, and so I'm chairing this meeting. Our first order of business is public comment. We have 3 cards, Gary Lambert, Nancy Marciniak, and Glenn Ludwig in that order. So Gary, over to you for 3 minutes.
With all the publicity that's been about the last week or two, radio, TV, newspaper, last week I went back and rewatched the video of the February 20th special meeting. For any of you who haven't, that were on the council at that time, I suggest you go back and watch it and see what the public comments were and the city council comments were. Also for the new members, if you didn't have the opportunity to do that participation. It seems like here we are 2.5 years later, and nothing's changed. Years and years ago, I was taking some classes at ISU, took some classes on Lincoln, and to do a bunch of papers that I hated doing. I picked up on a comment or a quote there from him. Don't like to read, but it was, nearly all men can stand adversity. But if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Tonight's meeting, we're going to talk about, I believe, our capital forecasts. It's going to say that we need a bunch of money. I don't doubt that those things need doing. But it just seems that when it comes to funding those things that truly have to be done, it's a crisis. We have to raise taxes to pay for those things. But somehow, there's always money available for the nice-to-haves. Last week's meeting was a good example of that, trying to add 3 new bodies. Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy Marciniak and Glenn Ludwig then.
Hi. Feels like my first time again. Hi. I have to read. Sorry, I can't do it any other way. Hi, my name is Nancy, and sometimes I'm a bad communicator. If I had the energy, I'd form a group, because it seems to me like I'm not the only one who could use a 12-step program. A few weeks ago, I made some carefully prepared remarks during public comment, but in the last few seconds of those remarks, an unintended tone of vehemence crept into my comments. When I thought about it later, I realized that the tone had been a flare-up of a long-ago anger. As I thought about it further, I realized, that the words I had chosen and prepared for that particular portion of my remarks had also been formed from the banked embers of that long-ago anger. So those words didn't ring clearly. I'd like to fine-tune a little. I'm afraid those few words could be construed as a rebuke against an individual's right to be protective of themselves, their family and friends, their home, or their livelihood. That was not my intent. I believe it is only natural for any individual to be protective of these persons and things. And I believe that individuals can and should come together to protect and preserve the people and assets of a community. But if in so doing you provoke or promote violence and hate, whether openly or by subterfuge and manipulation, I am against that. This is my thinking in the general case. The points get finer in specific cases, as they usually do. Luckily, most individuals have common sense. Might be some difference of opinion there. And a community of individuals can rely on local laws and constitutional guidelines. I hope I have made my thinking a little clearer, and if I offended anybody with ill-chosen words, I very sincerely apologize. Words and tone matter, but I hope we don't jump to conclusions when the real problem is bad communication. On a separate note, I attended the Bloomington 101 classes last spring and had the opportunity to learn firsthand about the quality of work done every day by all city departments and staff. I would like to extend a collective thanks for all their efforts, and I owe them an apology for being so belated in my acknowledgments. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
And Mr. Lambert? Or Mr. Ludwig, I'm sorry.
My time is for, what I got to say is not as important as what you've got to talk about.
Okay, thank you. All right, we turn our attention now to approving the Committee of the Whole meeting minutes for June the 19th. Could I get a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Alderman Painter. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Alderman Bray, and this is a roll call vote, correct?
Alderman Matthey,
Yes.
Alderman Sage,
Yes.
Alderman Malumweb,
Yes.
Alderman Burgess,
Yes.
Alderman Painter,
Yes.
Alderman Schmidt,
Yes.
Alderman Black,
Yes.
Alderman Hallman,
Yes.
Alderman Bray.
Yes.
Thank you. We turn now to the Fire Service Strategic Planning presentation. City Manager Hales, did you want to kick that off?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Let me first just make a few comments about not only tonight's discussion, but also what's coming up over the next 4 months. It is, I think, time to hopefully begin to allocate more of our time in these meetings, work session, regular meetings, coming back to the topic of infrastructure, which I think, as we all know, the citizens, as we went through the comprehensive plan, continued to put at the top of the priority list and wanting to make sure we're addressing that. As you know, in the area of infrastructure, you were provided with a draft 5-year CIP. It's been many months since we last had discussion, but that doesn't mean we haven't been addressing it. We have, but there's been a lot of other issues kind of come up. Tonight, we're bringing and going to be talking about that in general and some issues related to that, but we're also going to also tonight, in the next couple of months, continue a discussion. Tonight, we're going to have Brian Moore talking about fire strategic planning, especially what we're trying to do to address the council's priority of reducing EMS response time. We're going to share with you what we think is a real positive and a success of our deep dive into fire response data analytics with the help of the management analysts, position that's been filled again on how we're trying to even enhance and increase the confidence we can have in the numbers relating to response time, things of that nature. We're going to share with you what we're doing to continue our collaboration and cooperation with the town of Normal. As we've talked in the past about automatic vehicle locators, talking about working with the two communication systems, where yes, we have mutual aid, but we're even trying to take that a step further to where we can even begin to blur the line of the corporate boundary line, and how can we maximize the response time to our residents, irregardless of where they live, with the assets we have, equipment and manpower. And then as we end, we'll be talking about next steps and some things we're going to continue to work on, both, again, infrastructure related and others. In addition to infrastructure, and in addition to the capital improvement, we're going to talk about some ways to continue to jumpstart a major investment in infrastructure, but also to share with you the ongoing challenge we face with the lack of funding, especially in our enterprise funds, sanitary, sewer, and stormwater, as well as general tax revenue supported projects. And then at the end tonight, we'll talk about priority-based budgeting and what I strongly believe, Melissa Hahn and others, could be a tool to help us all, because we'll continue to remind you tonight and over the next 4 months what we see coming in the future. And the General Assembly, the state of Illinois, did us no good deed when they, again, have impacted and reduced some of the revenue we could have otherwise been anticipating, but it's going to be cut out of future budgets. All in all, we'll continue. We've got several master plans in next week. You'll hear more about the so-called street master plan, which hasn't been talked about much for a couple of years. We'll be bringing the Brick Streets master plan. There's also the downtown streetscape, and we kind of want to coordinate that with the recommendations of the downtown task force, because there is some significant integration there. And then hopefully in the months ahead, as you begin to put your kind of stamp of approval on this 5-year capital improvement plan, hopefully we have you adopt this 5-year plan, which is going to be a critical document really showing what we can spend, but also what revenue and revenue streams do we have to fund that, whether totally pay-as-you-go, or hopefully it's kind of maybe some debt issuance together with some enhanced revenue to help us deal with kind of some significant backlog of deferred maintenance. So this is just kind of an overview. This is the first night I think we're coming back to this talking about infrastructure. We're going to keep many of these issues at a high level, because that's critically important at this stage, even though over the next couple of months we're going to get back into more detail as we begin to draft what you're willing to support in the way of ultimate financial policy documents on how we're going to demonstrate to the community that we are ready to reinvest in infrastructure and maybe in some creative, innovative ways. So with that, Mayor and Council, what I'd like to do is kind of turn to Brian Moore, who's going to give the 20-minute presentation followed by 20-minute discussions. And keep in mind, this is kind of the high level. The other thing I just wanted to mention, because this is one of the priorities of the council, also take the comments tonight. What we're going to share with you is a status report. What have we been doing since last fall when you supported allocation of additional money to bring down our emergency response times? And I think this will be a good catch-up to show with you some of the things we've been dealing with and some of the ideas and recommendations we have for your consideration tonight and going forward. So with that, I'll turn to the Fire Chief, Brian Moore. Brian.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, City Council, City Manager Hales, for this opportunity to present the Fire Department's vision, the strategic plan to address the emergency response times. issue that we've been seeing. In 1995, I was a member of the strategic planning committee that the fire department set up under the leadership of Fire Chief Alan Otto at the time. It was a little over a year-long process that we went through, and this is the mission statement that was originally set up back then. I'm proud that I was a part of that at that point in time, but we use this mission statement as we make decisions about our deployment and how we serve our citizens. This presentation, I know some of you have seen this before. This is something that Chief Kimmerling had presented a few years ago when we first started talking about emergency response times. And the NFPA 1710 is the standard of organization and deployment of fire suppression operations, emergency medical operations, and special operations to the public by career fire departments. The 6-minute response time is important to know for both an EMS call and a fire call. I'll provide a little more information here in a few slides. It'll kind of help illustrate why that's important. But what the 6-minute response time is comprised of is the amount of time that it takes the dispatcher to receive that call, process that information into the computer-aided dispatch system, and notify the fire department. That's the dispatch time. It also includes the turnout time from the time the fire department receives that call until the time we can get en route to the scene. That's our turnout time. And then last but not least is the travel distance. Those three things make up what's called the response time. Another portion of the NFPA 1710 is also the full alarm assignment or to establish an effective response force. For a fire, it's 15 people. That's basically getting the first 3 engine companies, the ambulance, the battalion chief, and the EMS shift supervisor en route and on scene at the call within 10 minutes. In your packet, it said 9 minutes. I made the correction. I didn't catch that the first time I went through there, but it's 10 minutes is that response, is what that overall response time is for the effective response force. There are a bunch of duties that need to be taken care of, whether it be in a cardiac arrest, whether it be a structure fire. Cardiac arrest, you've got the patient, you've got to get an IV established, you've got defibrillator to get on the patient, intubate the patient, deliver medications, so that more than just 2 people can perform. Can 2 people do it? Certainly, but they can't do those tasks in a timely manner. So to improve the recovery of a cardiac arrest victim or a respiratory arrest victim, the more people we can get on that scene, the higher the chances, of survival, or the better service we can provide to that victim. In a structure fire, we've got water supply, forcible entry. We've got to get a line on the fire. We've got to get the extinguishing agent on the fire. We've got to do search and rescue. Once the fire's out, we've got to do overhaul, try to reduce the impact that fire had on that homeowner. Again, the fewer people you throw at that, the longer it takes to get those things done. The 10 minutes is associated with the amount of time before a fire would flash over and then fire would extend past that original room of origin. And here's the illustration of that. At anywhere from 10 minutes roughly is where that fire will go to flash over. There's a lot of evidence that shows that because of home furnishings that we have today, that point to flash over is much quicker than what it was even with this illustration here. I've got another illustration that's going to show a time lapse of basically how fire doubles in size every 30 seconds. But again, that effective response force is associated with that 10-minute response time. So there's a method here why we try to get our personnel on scene in a timely manner so that we can reduce that impact to our citizens. So here, this next slide here, back up one. So the display is not real good, but you can see this is basically what the ignition of a fire caused by such a thing like a cigarette. At 30 seconds, again, it's just getting developed. At 1 minute, you can see how it's more than doubled in size. At that point in time, it's grabbing more fuel, consuming more fuel. It's got plenty of oxygen. At 1 minute and 30 seconds, again, it's doubling again. As we increase, you can see now you've got a lot of smoke at the ceiling level. What is smoke is unburned fuel. As we get to the 2 minutes and 30 seconds, you've got fire consuming the room, but there's still a lot of unburned fuel at the ceiling level. And then in 2 minutes and 30 seconds, in this illustration, this room has gone to flash over. Again, that depends on the fuel, the furnishings that are in the room, how much oxygen is available. So not all rooms are going to act like this. Building construction, older homes, smaller rooms compared to new modern construction with open floor plans, that all changes how the fire progresses. The most impactful one, I think, for most people is the amount of time it takes once the heart stops until brain death starts to occur. on a cardiac arrest victim. When we teach CPR, we refer to like the 1 minute rule. So in 1 minute, that person's chance of being resuscitated decreases by 10%. So at the 6 minute response time, we're already down to a 40% chance of resuscitating that victim. So anything above that, of course, we're starting to decrease. Two things that we try to really stress when we're doing public education: smoke alarms, early detection of a fire, notifying the fire department, and getting everybody out of the house. The other thing is we teach a lot of CPR. Bystander CPR, even if you don't do ventilations, the amount of oxygen that's in the blood being circulated will help reduce the impact on that cardiac arrest if we can get there and resuscitate that victim. So this is a new way of reporting. You've probably seen this in the city manager's monthly report, and there's been a lot of questions as to what this actually means. It does look a little confusing. I apologize for that, but I feel that this is the best way to illustrate what the response times are. We talk about the 90th percentile. We've just started reporting on the 90th percentile. In the past, we were reporting on the average. Even on our average reporting last year, because we didn't have a management analyst, the quality of that report was just not very good. There's a lot of calls that need to be cleaned and removed from that because either they weren't an emergency, there was either an error with a dispatch time, so it's not accurate to report that time. But we were seeing the average a year ago running about 6 minutes. The reality is, now that we've got Paul, he's working hard to help improve our reporting. We've improved some of our CAD exports that are the information that's being dumped out of our CAD system into our record management system, so it's more accurate to break up those times. But as you can see, from 2016, we made some significant deployment changes in our dispatching protocols in the 1st of December in 2016. As you can see, on our average, we've improved about 15 seconds in the average time, right? So the 50th percentile. So what that's saying is 50% of our calls we're responding to in less than 4 minutes and 52 seconds currently. In 2016, it was 5 minutes and 7 seconds. If you look at the 90th percentile, we've seen a great improvement from 8 minutes and 29 seconds to 7 minutes and 53 seconds. Again, I attribute these to the changes that we made in those dispatching protocols. There is a negative impact to that because we are increasing how much those other units are now affected. So we've got more units responding, but again, it's to address this one particular time to increase the chances of survival. On the fire response, you can see the same thing. We still are seeing some improvements. However, if you look at that 90th percentile, we've seen a slight increase in that time. I attribute that to just the fact that our units are busy between their day-to-day maintenance activities, training activities, hydrant testing. The number of calls that they're going on, the number of runs have just increased. Every year they're increasing. So does that, hopefully that explains the percentile, because I know it gets confusing. Basically, the 90th percentile is just telling us that 10% of our calls, or last year 1,000 calls, it took us over 9 minutes and 37 seconds to get to. Or excuse me, 8 minutes and 22 seconds to get to at the 90th percentile. This is a scatter map that Paul put together. I apologize for maybe the quality of the map, but this is just to illustrate and show you where we're able to meet that performance benchmark. So you can see, even in the Northeast, the Southwest, the West, the East, we're able to meet that response time a majority of the time. Our next illustration, this is the over 6 minute response time. What I want you to focus on here is that we have more calls in the central core of our community that we're still not able to get to, as opposed to the Northeast. We know we've got a travel distance problem in that Northeast. We know we have the travel distance to the far Southwest. Those extreme areas that we have developing, it's going to take us a time before we can apply those resources to those areas. But we've got to focus on making sure that we get the appropriate resources in the right locations so that we can meet those performance benchmarks.
Right, before you leave there for a second, let me just stay on that for a minute, because going back to the graphs you had there on EMS response time, I think what you're showing is at the 6 minute mark, about 70% of our responses are within that 6 minutes.
Correct.
Meaning that, let's see, 70%. Is that what I said?
Yes.
So 30% of our responses exceed the 6-minute response time. And I notice here some of, I think the last category you had at 95%, not over 9 minutes. But I just want that to sink in, because I think the one thing we can all do is relate, what if that was our house? What if that was one of our loved ones? Or because when you have 30% of the EMS responses past the 6-minute response time, and it's not just in one area, it's not just in the Northeast, this is throughout the entire city. You're talking about a lot of response time. How many runs approximately?
That'd be 3,000 calls for 30%.
3,000 calls out of, what is it, 9,000?
Over 10,000, we're 10,800 last year.
No. Yeah, please write that down. 3,000, over 3,000 calls in a year's time exceed the 6-minute response time target. And yes, that's a national target, things like that. Boy, when you start getting into 8 minutes, 9 minutes, and I bet you there's even some of these calls that are over 10 minutes. Luckily, it's not that many. You can never, and I think that's a key, you can never staff up to have 100% of all your responses, under 6 minutes. And that's why as we continue to talk here, we're also looking at, well, how can we, working with Normal and the two fire departments, EMS responses together, continue to look at ways jointly to bring that number down. And yes, we each need to do our part, but I think that's critical, and watch for the recommendations and how we what we see some of the next steps to continue in collaboration, in both fire departments and both communities.
I do want to make sure I correct something there, because I probably misspoke. So yeah, we went over 10,000 calls last year, but not all of those calls were actually the high priority calls that we track the response time. So I just want to make that clarification, and not to lessen the impact of that, but to say that it was 3,000 high priority Delta level calls that we didn't make in that time would not be accurate. I could try to get that information for you, but I just want to make sure I was accurate on that reporting. So. Just history of the Bloomington Fire Department ambulance service. So in 1990, the fire department staffed 2 basic life support ambulances, and Lifeline Mobile Medics, which was a cooperation between Broman and St. Joe's, staffed 2 paramedic ambulances. At that time, we ran 2,966 calls. There were some calls at that point in time that we just didn't have an ambulance available, because at that point in time, we were a jump company, so if there was a structure fire, we might not have anybody to staff those ambulances, and it might take a little bit either for callback or to get units back to the station in order to staff that ambulance. So Lifeline would at that time pick up those calls. So I don't know the exact number of calls that were at that point in time, because we wouldn't have tracked the ones that Lifeline responded to. In 97, we increased our staffing and had added 3 ambulances, put a 3rd ambulance at the number 2 fire station, which was on McGregor, shortly before we opened the new fire station on Hamilton. At that point in time, Lifeline was still in business and ran, again, 2 paramedic units at that time, and we ran just under 4,000 medical calls then. In 2006, we increased to 4 ambulances. 1, of course, was a paramedic. 2 of them were what we called intermediate life support, where they did IV therapy, but they didn't actually carry some of the drugs that are used for cardiac and respiratory type events. And then we had 2 what we called paramedic chase vehicles, which were a Ford Explorer that had the medications, and a paramedic would respond and upgrade that intermediate level ambulance to a paramedic level, so we could go give basically advanced life support to that patient. And at that point in time, Lifeline had actually gone out of business. Looking at today, 2016, we respond 4 paramedic ambulances in the city, and we still have that 1 EMS chase vehicle, which is staffed by our EMS supervisor. He basically runs around to calls within the city, but also can go outside the city and provide mutual aid to incoming ambulances that need to upgrade to advanced life support. They also help with our protocols and administration of different policies and procedures to provide basically the ambulance service. You can see our call volume has increased with the same 4 ambulances from 5,502 all the way up to 8,327. I had wrote down some notes because we had, I just checked the calls today. We're 138 calls ahead of where we were at 6 or 7 o'clock this morning, as we were last year at this time. And in 2013, we ran just over 8,000 calls. Some of the studies that I'm going to talk about from from the Illinois Fire Chiefs Association were done in 2013. That's why I thought it was important just to show that we've increased over 300 calls since that study was done. This is just an illustration because as I was pointing out with the scatter map showing the different response times, in 2016, Response District 1A and 1B, which is headquarters primary response district, received 4,315 EMS calls. So that's almost half of the medical calls within our whole community were in those 2 districts. So again, that's a community risk profile that we need to look at, we need to address. Of that, 3,445 of those calls Medic 1 handled. So that means that roughly 900 were calls that we had to bring an ambulance from either Station 2, Station 3, or Station 4 to handle those calls. So the fire engine responds, they initiate patient care, work on the patient while the ambulance is coming from out of district. We knew that was adding a minute 57 seconds to our response time prior to last December. One of the things that we changed was just getting that the closest available fire apparatus automatically dispatched at the time of the call. That way there wasn't a lag in that dispatch. So Medic 1 covered 3,772 runs. I talk about runs because they also respond to fire calls. So although they handled 3,445 medical calls, they ran 3,772 times out the door. So there were 3 studies that were performed in 2012. 5 Bugles came in and did a study on a station feasibility study. We needed to do that for several reasons. As we're looking to improve station location or our deployment, it was important to have an outside company come in and look at, are our stations in the proper location? Do they serve our community well? We knew that we had a lot of renovation projects that needed to be done, a lot of maintenance that needed to be performed on stations. So before we put that money into renovating those stations, we want to make sure that somebody else looked at our deployment. Also with that, the airport, we were looking to negotiate that airport contract as well. So again, before we negotiated something for Station 3, we wanted to make sure that Station 3 was in a viable location for us. The Illinois Fire Chiefs did a study then in January of 2013 on assessment of deployment and staffing, and then in late 2013, December 2013, they did a functional consolidation with the town of Normal and Bloomington, looking at ways that we could consolidate and work together operationally to improve our response to both communities. So accomplishments, I talked about how we've made some improvements in response times. We worked hard over the last few years to improve our traffic preemption equipment. We've gotten new updated equipment that send the information from the vehicle to the signals. We've improved the infrastructure on the traffic signals. Again, that was an Illinois Fire Chief's recommendation. We upgraded headquarters fire engine to an intermediate life support, so they're carrying the IV therapy. They've got a higher level defibrillator so that they can initiate that patient care and get more of those steps done prior to the ambulance arriving on scene. The management analyst was hired. Paul Alfrank joined us in January and has been a great addition. He's able to work through the data and help pull reports for me, improve just our tracking of what the community risk looks like. He's working on trying to improve, looking at maps and the data that how we're reporting our data. We're going to be changing to image trend record management system here in the near future. It was just approved in council last meeting, and again, that as we get into that process, he's going to be very instrumental in making sure that we're reporting on the right things and getting all the areas set up before we start that transformation into the new record management system. We installed turnout timer at headquarters. This is a beta test. Everything that I read says that if you put that turnout timer at the front door, as the firemen are going out to the call, it improves that situational awareness. Although our average turnout time is well under a minute, on the 90th percentile it's not. So again, what's happening? Sometimes can that be a station design? Is it the distance from the bedroom for nighttime to the apparatus? Is it the time that it takes the door to go up? There's a lot of things that go into play, and so as we're currently working with an architect right now on Station 3, that's one of the things that we tasked him with, making sure that we design the station so that the firemen can move from the living quarters area to the apparatus in a swift manner. We hired 3 additional personnel in 2014 to reduce overtime and also to help reduce the risk the employees are working the extra overtime, trying to reduce injuries. We hired another 3 in 2015. Again, right now, we're down 8 personnel. So although we've managed to reduce the number of injuries this past year, currently we're down 8. We've had some delays in our testing process, but we should be set up so that we can get some people hired this fall. Again, going into the winter when we have less people off on leave, we should be able to staff a second ambulance more frequently. But we utilize the Starcom radio system. Normal was using it prior to us. Again, this helps with interoperability with the Normal Fire Department, improves our dispatching capabilities. We're using our records management system to look at our community risk. Again, that's work that Paul is doing, pulling that data from the system. And we're using that data to make those changes, such as what we did already in December of last year. The other thing we've tasked the apparatus committee with looking at the apparatus, make sure that we're not overbuilding these things. Fire trucks are so big and bulky, they weigh a lot. The truck 3 at Station 3, which is our largest response district, weighs almost what a semi weighs. So to have that respond in 6 minutes, can it travel 4 minutes just like a car? Not really. So again, those are things that we're looking at. We challenged the apparatus committee to look at that and try to design apparatus around our own community, make sure that we're putting apparatus in the right location to improve our response. So recommendations. The first thing that back in January when we were talking about the tax levy, my recommendation was that for that $540,000, I'd like to staff a second ambulance to help reduce those response times. And what I was trying to illustrate is the fact that I know our Northeast is a problem in terms of travel distance, but we have 246 emergency calls in that entire area compared to the 1,000 calls in the downtown that we weren't able to respond to. So is it more effective to reduce those response times by putting an ambulance in the Northeast today when we have more of a need currently in our downtown area? What I would propose is that because we're already late in the year, I would like to hire the three personnel for this first year. We've already, last year, on one shift that we were fully staffed, we were able to staff that second ambulance and start to accumulate some data. It's a small data set, so it's not really efficient for me to show you accurately how it's going to address those times. We get a larger data set this next year by increasing our staffing by 3. We'll be able to put that ambulance on the street more effectively over this next year when we're at full staff, so we can start accumulating more data. I would also propose that we use some of that money to roll into our overtime and that we would staff that during peak operational periods. We know that we start increasing our calls at 6 o'clock in the morning and our calls start to decrease at 6, 7 o'clock at night. I would propose that when we don't have adequate staffing to staff that second ambulance for the entire day, that we would use overtime to staff it from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Again, that's going to allow us to accumulate more data. I'd like to form a joint agency committee with the town of Normal. Sorry.
Before you leave that for a second, let's just talk about timing, because, even, can you just comment on, is that second ambulance available now? And we've talked about this. How can we, in a more immediate way, begin to staff that during some of these peak hours? So even prior to increasing that personnel, when do you think that second ambulance could be staffed during some peak hours, even by using existing personnel?
Yeah, so one of my hesitations to start that immediately is just the fact that we've already seen that our overtime has been so high, and the fact that we're down 8 personnel. I would like to get our staffing increased by October and then start that on October 1st or maybe November 1st, start that 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. with overtime. My fear is just that there's so much overtime at this point in time, I'm afraid we'd drive up our injuries and again cost us even more money at that point. So The other thing is, and it was commented, I think with Alderman Fruin at the time, but we had 2 ambulances last budget year. Both those ambulances are in currently, and we have them in operation today. We weren't increasing the numbers. We have 2 reserve ambulances and 1 in ready reserve. So to staff the second ambulance, we wouldn't be coming and asking you to purchase another ambulance. Again, we've got 2 in reserve and a third one sitting there waiting in case we need to put another one into service. So we're covered from that standpoint.
Thank you.
So the joint agency committee with the town of Normal, I meet with Chief Humer frequently, and so do the deputy chiefs. We meet and discuss our deployment and cooperation and mutual aid. But again, I'd like to set this up as a more formal meeting and meet quarterly and discuss some of those things, such as AVL. AVL, we know, could improve some response times. But for what's the saying? Every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. For instance, Normal's getting ready to move to their headquarters station on Main Street. That is going to be a very busy ambulance when it comes to ambulance calls. We know that. So if we go to AVL today and we don't set some parameters on that, ambulance out of headquarters Normal gets called away. We're going to be the next with our headquarters ambulance. We already know that our headquarters ambulance is overutilized, and we couldn't sustain that at this point. So we got to think through that process and make sure that we put policies together before that happens to keep from running into something that would cost us a lot more than what we were expecting, right? Again, hire 3 personnel next year after being able to look at the data. But data-driven, make this recommendation, come back next year and say, look, by staffing that second ambulance full-time, I could hire the other 3 personnel. That would give me the 6 for staffing purposes, and then we wouldn't be driving it on overtime. But again, I want to do that with data and come back to you with that data to show what the impact was with that second ambulance. Follow facility master plan. Again, that was a presentation that was given November of 15. To follow through, part of that was the Northeast Station, identify what that location is. We want to perform a study that is going to look at what is the ideal location. Is there a location that would be mutually beneficial to the town of Normal and the city of Bloomington? Or do both communities need to work together in terms of our mutual aid? And I talked about that effective response force. That's where I can really see where we can have an impact on both communities, is when we're talking about that dividing line and we get on either side of that line assisting each other to meet that effective response force. So neither community is trying to pull their farthest resource to meet that effective response force. So then in FY19, we'd like to purchase that property for the Northeast Station. In FY20, we'd like to go out for architectural design. And then that way in FY21, we'd be prepared to build that new station. Again, we need to have the recommendations. We need to know where that optimum location is. We need to make sure that property is available, be able to secure that. So it's that planning process moving forward. Again, continue to monitor our community risk. Again, looking at our data, looking at our performance. The city manager's monthly report is very beneficial from my standpoint, because I get to see it and look at it and try to make decisions based on how that's been impacted by the number of calls, the location of those calls. So that's the end of my
Let me just add a few other comments. I do want to stress that several of those dealt with this ongoing collaboration and cooperation with Normal, because first and foremost, that joint agency committee was recommended by the Illinois fire chiefs. Yes, it would probably have a lot of technicians, but the one thing we want to continue to do is how can both entities work together for the betterment of the whole, such with automatic vehicle locators or location technology. Yeah, that's been fully implemented in Bloomington. It hasn't quite up and Normal, but it's not just the technology, it's then the communication centers, and that's one of the things where ultimately we want to have, even at the council level of the 2 cities, how can we really push that along so that can be utilized in both communities, both communication centers, because if there's a Bloomington or Normal ambulance, even if it's in the other city within 2 blocks of your home, wouldn't you rather have that coming and be in there instead of waiting 6 minutes or things of that nature? There's other traffic preemption. That's another issue. We talk about EMS, fire suppression, and the engine companies. So as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to go beyond this just mutual aid into how can we almost be functionally integrated with one another. We've got to work through union issues, work rules, things of this nature, which right now is kind of an impediment. So we will be getting these reports to you because I think it's that functional consolidation I think every council member would benefit reviewing this, because there's a lot of great ideas of how we can, even if they're two separate departments, how can we functionally on a day-to-day basis be so integrated that we go above and beyond, the mutual aid, and trying to maximize, again, the lowest response time, the highest quality turnout of manpower for the interests of the public safety. And last, I would just point out is the location study. We need to kind of finish this study. Normal has completed, I think, a year or two ago, kind of a similar study up in the Northeast. We're trying to get ours underway, get that completed, because then we want to kind of share that between the two and continue to look at how we could collaborate and cooperate. But I want to stress something. The biggest cost we have in the fire service delivery, whether it's EMS or suppression, isn't the bricks and mortar. It's the manpower. When you look at, it's just this ambulance. By the time we're done, let's see, when we fully staff, say that second ambulance at headquarters, we're talking to get about 6 paramedics, paramedic firefighters. So as we continue to look at, we're also trying to, again, in this collaboration between the two entities, how can we not only reach economies of scale on bricks and mortar, but how can we do it with even the much more expensive, and that is the labor costs. And again, we don't want to cut corners per se, but there's much more we can do from functional consolidation, and that's what Brian and I, together with our counterparts in Normal, have been having discussion on, and we want to continue. In fact, I think the whole issue of public safety is going to be one of those great topics, I think, for a future joint meeting of the two councils of these cities. So those are some things we wanted to leave you with today, and you may need to help us. I think we went a little over on the 20 minutes, but how much, Mayor, I'll turn it back to you and the City Council.
Alderman Burgess?
Yeah, I thank you, first of all, for your presentation, and I really like the way you have portrayed the information here, because it makes it easy to understand the scope of the issue and what kind of challenges we have to deal with. And I think a number of our conversations in the past have focused on the response times in the northeast and southwest quadrants as being an issue that's going to require a lot of time and thought and perhaps a lot of investment to deal with. But what really surprised me is, because I think those conversations created the impression in my mind, and maybe others, that was where the majority of the response time issues were. But when it comes to this point map, I think that really drives home that this is an issue facing our entire city, and is an issue that is very pertinent and important to the central portion of our city and needs solutions. So I had a question for you. When it comes to the central portion of the city and those response times, it looks like your recommendations are focused on staffing. And based on the information we have now, what's your level of confidence that those staffing issues and ramping up our staffing could go, could be effective at achieving reduced response times in the central portion of our city?
I'm highly confident. We know when we made those dispatch changes in December, we saved 20 seconds off of the time. We saw that even without having Paul there to pull the data out and really help us to define that. But the reality is just that even though we actually have resources here available, right, with the engines and trucks, we're overutilizing those to the point where we're driving up some of the other times. So again, by having the appropriate resource, one of the things that I've talked about is that at some point in time, we're going to have to move some resources to that northeast. There was discussion a couple years ago when Station 5 was going to open to move an engine company out of headquarters out to that station. Chief Kimmerling made a bold decision with City Manager Hales to not make that move. That would have cost time tremendously because that resource would be constantly responding all the way into the headquarters response district. We didn't have great data. We had an intern that was pulling data at that point in time. It was very beneficial. But again, having that right resources for the 4,300 and some calls that were EMS calls, to have 2 ambulances there, that is going to change the unit hour utilization of both the engine and the truck at headquarters. That'll reduce that. At that point in time, we need to be able to take a look at the entire community, all of our resources, and see what that unit hour utilization is, and then move some of those resources around to help get our distribution of those resources to address that 6-minute response time. It's all about concentration and distribution of those resources and how we can fine-tune those. But having the second ambulance will have a significant impact on those 1,000 calls, which is 10%, of our call volume.
If I can just add to that, as the chief and I have had many discussions. I can count on one hand the times in the last 8.5 years we've been at full staffing in the fire department and the police department. There's no doubt, we have high expectations. We have an integrated fire suppression and EMS. It sometimes can be a challenge from hiring, so and I think that's kind of one of the challenges. We need to continue to have some discussion with the council because I think this is a model, but it's also one that, unlike Peoria, Champaign, some of these other cities that only focus on suppression, there's challenges. There's pros and cons to what we have, but there's also some other models out there that sometimes you can kind of feel if you're just strictly looking at EMS. And especially in Bend, Oregon, we had 8 and 10 hour EMS shifts, and that wasn't the same level of expertise and that was necessary than from maybe suppression. But that's a good conversation. I wish Brian could go out and hire those 8 positions. We could have them on the road and continue to implement this, but that hasn't been the reality from...
Alderman Matthey.
Chief, thanks for the awesome presentation. One of the things that popped out at me is that it looks like that the rate of increase of ambulance calls is outpacing the rate of increase in population. Can you talk to that at all?
It is, and we also know Paul's done some trying to pull some data in terms of the number of beds of other familiar or other facilities, but we know we've got 3 extended care facilities that are going to be opening up here very shortly. We know that the Northeast has 2, and that's going to impact us 200 calls in that service area alone in the next year, based on the number of beds, the type of facility that is. So we know that those are going to continue to rise. We still try to address the high frequency calls. We put resources towards trying to get them the right help that is needed to try to reduce those. But again, we don't have a lot of resources. We don't have a lot of available resources to put towards that community risk reduction model. Stuart, who was here, but I think he left, does a great job of getting out in the community and doing education. But again, there's other things involved in a true community risk reduction model, looking at, say, different care facilities and the type of calls that we're getting, and then working with their people to help reduce those calls, whatever that might be, in terms of slip and fall calls, installing handrails, making sure that they're doing the right things to provide for their customers so that it reduces the impact on our service. But again, that is what we're seeing nationwide. We're seeing 78 to 80% of the calls being EMS for all fire departments. Whether you're a transporting ambulance or not, you still have to go on those calls. You still have to go and initiate patient care and take care of those patients.
So that's just another, we read all the time about all the effects of the baby boomer generation. This is just another ancillary effect as we're going along there. One of the questions I got from a resident a couple weeks ago, and I don't know if this is still relevant or not, surrounded cell phones and E911, that they called and ended up in the Metcom system, then they had to get transferred out of there over into our system. Is that still an issue? Is that a cell carrier issue? Is that an issue on our side? Where is that issue at?
I'm not technically very good at answering that question for you. However, I do know that, of course, when E911 came in, the calls that were Bloomington addresses were getting directly sent into the Bloomington Dispatch Center. There is some, I'm not sure if it's federal regulation that they have to be able to get the GPS coordinate off of that phone, and I might be using the wrong term, so please bear with me. I really wish Darren was here to answer that, but there is a time frame when that is supposed to be improved.
Okay. And then just for reference for myself, we use the paramedic firefighter model here. Is that the same thing? Does Normal do that as well?
Correct.
Okay, so we match there when we're talking about integration and working together.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Alderman Mulumby.
Could you, Brian, talk about what is involved in a location study?
Okay, I don't have the scope of work in front of me, but again, what we want them to look at is, so the street that it's on, whether it's a thoroughfare, you want to make sure that it's got accessibility, you want to look at bridges, you want to look at rail, but you want to look at the travel distance from areas of other stations, from boundaries, and then you also want to look at future growth of the community, which we know the Northeast is starting to limit out right now. And most of our development is going towards the Grove now. So, but we would want to look at that and make sure that whoever's doing that study has that information as well to find how that new station would integrate with current stations, with the town of Normal, to provide the best time for that neighborhood, that response district.
What about the cost? Do you have an idea how much?
I don't know yet. We're going out for a request for qualifications at this point in time.
Alderman Black and then Bray.
Thank you, and thank you, Chief, for the excellent report. I just really wanted to focus on, I heard you say it at least 4 times, and David said it a few times, and every time I heard it, collaboration with Normal, I looked around and I saw a lot of nodding heads here. And it made me reflect in the last few years. I've heard this conversation many times, and the last thing that I recall saying, and I could be wrong, was that Normal had kind of walked away from the table. Is that the case anymore, or they're back at the table? What is the current status of working together?
I can say that we've continued to have conversations, especially on the administrative and the fire, and I'll applaud the fire chiefs and all the firefighters. They work excellent on a day-to-day basis. There's no doubt, about 3 years ago, the Normal Council did approve kind of a strategic plan of relocating and building new fire stations. They had done kind of a location study, so they are ahead of the game, especially in our case, because they have these locations. We continue to talk about the AVL and others, but again, it just hasn't moved as quickly as we'd like. There's going to be other issues, traffic preemption, et cetera. But now, too, we're trying to look at, and we're trying to catch up with Normal in getting this Northeast location study done, and then talk about, okay, what's going to be that strategy just for the Northeast? But I think that's where I want to continue to stress. It is not just the Northeast. And as Brian has said, and as we've talked about it, they've got their main station, which is not too far, north of our downtown and others. So this functional consolidation is going to be looking at all aspects of integration on a functional standpoint, day in and day out, irregardless, of where these stations are, with full implementation of AVL. We'll continue that, but I do think the day will come when we just need more of the political dialogue and discussion between the two councils to ensure that, we're all aiming for the same high priority in functional consolidation between the two entities. Not merger, but, so it's as seamless as you can get from an emergency response time and collaboration of personnel and equipment.
So, thank you. I would say, looking at my crystal ball of this council, based on what I saw with the head nodding, that there is the political support to continue those discussions. And if it requires us to put something together to then present to Normal to get their feedback on, I'm ready to do that, because I've heard interrupters talked about for years. I've heard AVL talked about years. I mean, these are things that we need to actually start doing, because I look at the, we're what, if you go back to that one slide, we were a couple seconds more this year. How many more seconds next year? And until now we have an almost unmanageable problem. And David said it, we can't staff our way out of this problem. We have to get creative, and we have the data that's available. And if we need to take a leadership role in this, I'm willing to step out there and make that happen. And if we need to present to normal and say this is what we'd like to do, perhaps that's an approach. But as Alderman Sage is fond of saying, we'll define the what. If you guys work on the how on that stuff, because I can't think of all those things. But and to Alderman Matthews' point, before I leave doing the alderman stuff, I want to make it so when I call 911 on my cell phone that I don't have to automatically say transfer me to Bloomington. That is an outrageous thing that we have to do. I know there's E911 funding, and that's a complicated issue, but I don't have a landline. Many people don't have landlines anymore. That is a disservice to our community to spend those few seconds trying to figure it out. And occasionally Metcom will make me tell them the story before they even transfer me. So that's wasted time. And as somebody who has to call 911 somewhat frequently, that is a problem. So, I know that's not really part of this conversation, but as we approach, maybe our government partners, I'm willing to take a step forward in a political way to support these sorts of things and get the feedback from our partners, because it just seems like we've been talking about these issues and they've stagnated and they're not really any further along than I recall over the last few years.
If I can just emphasize, too, you brought up again, we may also have to revisit a serious discussion of the communication centers. There's two of them. And like you say, there is still a transfer. There is still a time issue that goes in. Mm-hmm. Bloomington, however, was the one that pulled out of Metcom, but inherent in that was some delays, in the transfers. Yet that's where I think it's also about 80% of the calls now, the 911 or 70% or something are through cell phones now. So,
and to someone who would suggest the status quo is acceptable, I would say, are you comfortable letting Bloomington residents have to wait a few precious more seconds while calls get transferred? If we need to revisit that, if they're mad about something that happened 15, 20 years ago, get over it. Lives are at stake. So I think we have to take a more aggressive approach on some of these issues. Thank you.
In terms of the AVL issue that we've been talking about, again, part of the delay was for Normal to actually get to that same level. And they had to work with Metcom to get the equipment and get that stuff. So just last year was when they actually went online, and it took us a while to get comfortable and get some of the bugs worked out with that system. And I think they're just now to that point. So we've been having those conversations, and there is some infrastructure that would have to be purchased to help join those two CAD systems, and there'd be a maintenance fee with that. But again, the bottom line is trying to improve those times and stuff.
And to be clear, I'm not saying it's our government partners that are holding us back or they're haven't done X, Y, and Z. I'm just saying that I'm ready to move some of these balls down the court, and if that means creating a joint agency, maybe we need to spell it out and approach them with it and then get their feedback and go from there, because it's time. It's well past time from where I sit.
Thank you. Well said. Alderman Bray?
Thank you, Chief, for your presentation, and thank you for your service and the service of our firefighters and your support there and the emergency services folks. All of us here in the council are just so grateful, and I know that the citizens are as well. As I campaigned and talked with folks, that they had so many good things to say about our fire services and emergency medical services, and it's important to people. So I really appreciate the time and the effort you've taken today to have a forward-thinking approach and kind of do these future projections about where is the growth in the city, where will the pull be, where will the resources need to be strategically located. So with that said, my question relates to whether or not we have any analytics that align with population. I know we've talked a lot about backward looking, about numbers of calls and then how we respond and the scatter graphs of where we go and the like. But are there any analytics out there that we can grab that relate to the fact that if you have a population of 80,000 or something like that, you can expect certain numbers of calls with construction of certain type and people? Thank you for mentioning the new facilities that are going to be out on GE Road Extended area, because that'll be another population bump over in the Northeast. So with that, that's kind of the nature of my question.
That's a great question. Every community is very diverse, okay? Mm-hmm. Every community has a different risk profile. So we don't have much in terms of industry, but again, how your age, at the age of different subdivisions, areas, that definitely has an impact. So I can't say for exactly that there is an analytic that I can go out and grab, but again, I've talked about other communities and their population base and how our call volume and the number of firefighters we have per capita compare. And we are on the high side of the calls per capita, and we're on the low side of the staffing per capita, just so you know.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Chief Moore. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now we'll turn our attention to our 5-year CIP.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. As Patty comes forward and begins to get ready, let me make a few comments. As you notice, you've only got a few pages here for this discussion tonight. That was deliberate. We didn't ask you to bring your thick volume of the 5-year CIP, but I did want to say a couple of things. The delay in coming back for this discussion of the 5-year CIP is not only because of the time commitment to the operating budget during this last 6 months, some personnel vacancies, the audit, and I could go on, but what we have recently done is we've updated our revenue numbers, which is such a key part of what can we project. And now that we have a good idea of how the state is beginning to take more and more of our revenue, and who knows what's going to happen in year 2 and 3, we've also continued to share with you what the projections are on the increasing gap between projected revenue and expenditures. There is still more work to do, but tonight what we want to focus on is these 2 scenarios. And as Patty will get into in a minute, one is kind of here's what little, and I want to stress, what little we can afford to do from the standpoint of infrastructure improvements or reinvestment in infrastructure over the next 5 years without additional revenue versus what we could do in the next 5 years if we had more revenue, especially in 2 categories, sanitary sewer and stormwater. It is almost in some ways embarrassing tonight to bring to you the fact that there is little we can do going forward in these 2 areas, the underground utilities, which are such a critical part to street resurfacing, but we wanted to make sure that we had some good, accurate analysis and information to share with you. One caveat, and I'll come back to this later on. Yes, there is revenue being generated by the sanitary sewer fees, the stormwater fees. Unfortunately, the bulk of that revenue is going to pay for maintenance costs, day-to-day operating expenses, manpower, equipment going out there. It unfortunately is not going mainly towards capital expenditures, the big sanitary sewer lining projects, the street channel rehabilitation projects, etc. And I'll share with you just very honestly and frankly, we need to get to the bottom of, is that appropriate? I think over the years there's probably been kind of a slow encroachment of trying to use the fees for operating expenses that maybe we need to pull back. And there needs to be kind of a reallocation of those 2 fees to how much goes to operating, how much goes to capital. But once you do that, you know, you're going to take money away from the general tax revenue, and you know what that looks like over the next 5 to 6 years. Secondly, after we go through a little discussion on that, we are going to bring to you tonight for a little discussion a bonding proposal. And the reason that's going to be important is we feel also from you that there's an urgency that we need to move ahead with some pretty significant infrastructure improvements. So we're going to talk to you for a few minutes about a bonding proposal which can buy us time. It can help us make sure we continue at a very aggressive and robust effort to keep looking and investing in underground utilities as well as street resurfacing, even if we need a little bit more time and effort in looking at the revenue solutions, both in sanitary sewer, stormwater, and general taxation. As you will see here, it is always much easier, I think, when you have an enterprise set up for water, sewer, stormwater, sometimes even golf, to have a dedicated revenue stream. But when it's general tax revenue, it is very difficult unless you have good, strong ordinances, policies that prevent the going in and robbing or at least diverting money from general tax revenue into capital. Just look at the state of Illinois and what they've done for decades, or the federal government and how they keep going into the highway trust fund, et cetera. It's nothing that's unique to Bloomington or anything else. So those are two topics we'll talk about, and then as we finish, then we'll have more discussion and next steps, how we want to proceed. So with that, Patty, if you go through the presentation and shedding further light on the current state of our CIP and what we've been working on recently.
Sure. So what you have in your packet are two graphs looking at the 5-year budget, CIP budget for both, approximately $300 million in capital projects and about $80 million funded for over the next 5 years. So right now I'm looking at the 5-year funded graph, and you can see that 53% of our projects in the next 5 years that are funded are streets, sidewalks, and ADA ramps. That includes motor fuel tax. In that line is the dedicated revenue for the street resurfacing program, which is about $25 million of that number. There's about 7.5 in there for Fox Creek. There's traffic signals, some Main Street corridor money, and then some others. As you look around the graph, you can see that water has a myriad of projects going. They've been saving their fund balance for quite some time. In year 4, though, that begins to run out for them, but that's a conversation for another day. And then you can see here that we do have some sewer funds here. In that number is about $3 million of sewer lining, $2 million in sewer mains, and some minor CSO costs that are funded. But really, there should be about $10 million over this 5 years in just the sewer lining program to kind of put that into perspective. Looking at parks, $1 million of that $1.5 million is funding for only this year out of the 5, and that relates to the money that we already have for the Creativity Center. There's no additional projects that can be afforded there. Stormwater has 0 projects. There is no money for stormwater. The library has some savings set aside for the design of a potential new library and some furniture, but no construction there. Facilities has $1.7 million budgeted, again, only for this year, and $1 million of that is the ADA work at the arena. It's the elevator and the sidewalks and alike. The fire department really doesn't have much money, and if you kind of follow along on the table below, that kind of gives you an idea of, what items do and don't have money out of those 5 years. So theoretically, we should be putting capital maintenance funds and other funds together every year, and I know I'm a broken record there, so I'll just move on to the unfunded graph. And the unfunded graph, these are capital project requests. These are things that have been updated from the draft capital plan that you've seen that we gave to you guys. And so to be debated or decided by council, but just to give you an idea of some of the things that are in there on the unfunded would be, some of the things that are in there are a potential new library, the operations center under facilities, and then about $20 million in needed facility repair around the city. The fires, largely fire stations. The streets includes Streets 2.0 of about $30 million. Again, all of this is debatable, but also what's in there is Hamilton Bund Commerce for about $15 million. In the parks, there's $10 million there for a Lincoln Leisure Center, Recreation Center, and an Aquatic Center. Sanitary sewers has a lot of sewer lining built up in there. Stormwater has about $4 million in combined sewers, $5 million in stream bank and floodplains, and about $3 million in rehab. and water unfunded is mainly distribution channels that need repair. So there's $300 million in projects or asks over the next 5 years. Again, some of those remain to be seen, but to David's point, and very timely, of course, is the sewer and stormwater, which has been ready, and some recommendations have made to you since our neighbors to the north have acted on sewer. We certainly have an exhibit that you have for you in terms of matching that rate. David talked about a bond proposal. We did put one together for you that you have, and there's some handouts in the back for those who don't have it. Again, these are just ideas of what it might look like. And if you want to talk about that a little bit, but in a happy world, the finance director would get both a rate increase and a bond issue rather than one or the other, but just putting that out there. And just for the record, Normal did not raise their stormwater fee because they do not have any projects. We have combined sewers and a lot more streams than they do, so please just keep that in mind. If you want to, because I know we're over, if there's no questions on these two charts, I would move you to some of the exhibits that I've hand-delivered to you.
Yeah. Let me kind of just, let's just look at this infrastructure bond for a moment, because I think it ties in well with kind of what is not being able to be funded. First off, there's Mayor Renner has brought up in the past this idea of maybe Streets 2.0, borrowing upwards of $20 million to really make a further aggressive effort of funding street resurfacing. As I've talked with him and as we've looked at this, just for illustration purposes, I've thrown in here $20 million together with, as an amount of money that could be allocated to street resurfacing, but I've added some other projects just to help show how if we were to borrow some money up front, how could we immediately make sure that we don't lose sight of some other critical needs. And that's why you see under sewer, there's $2 million allocated in this potential bond, $2 million for storm, and $2 million for water. So why is there $26 million? That's to ensure that at least for 2 construction seasons at least, maybe into a third, the bond proceeds would pay for all underground utility work necessary for any and all street resurfacing, irregardless of the situation we're in, in the sanitary sewer and stormwater fund. It could be a way of saying, at least for a couple of years, we're going to make sure that for the street resurfacing, that continues unabated in a very aggressive way, and bond proceeds will cover that. And then maybe what we could do is under especially sanitary sewer and stormwater with what little money is there, especially sanitary sewer, hopefully we can continue with an aggressive sewer lining program. Because again, sewer lining is separate from what we have to do for all these street resurfacing projects. And I've also thrown in a few other things here. I continue to hear from Jay and others that O'Neill pool, we're keeping our fingers crossed if we can get one more year of use out of that pool. I think we all have to realize we're facing the potential closure of one of the 2 summer, open swimming pools that we have. Now again, is it going to be 10 million? It's just a placeholder. It's just an estimate. But with the current master plan, we will be spending some time trying to better identify what are the various price options depending upon what you design. Everything from maybe a much more comprehensive aquatic center to everything from just replacing an outdoor pool. Some of these others, economic development, we can't forget what sometimes, as we've seen the last few years, we're constantly looking for opportunities to partner with the private sector or to move ahead on some other projects, either downtown or elsewhere. Fire Station 3, we're finishing up the plans for the remodeling of that station, but we lack the funding for the construction. That's what the $3.5 million will do. as you all know, we're very fortunate in that there's about $9 million that have been allocated now under IDOT, at least in the planning stages for the Hamilton-Bund Commerce. We've also got several other $1 million for the Fox Creek Road, and basically we have here $15 million, Fox Creek Road $7.5 million, to help ensure that if there's money, additional local share, especially for Hamilton, we would have the money to pay our local share for that. And then last but not least, I've thrown in here some money for at least land acquisition, possibly some design work for the operations center to replace currently what we have south of City Hall. When you take away the revenue that is going to be coming in from the state or from motor fuel tax or from other local sources, what you end up with is a possible $40 to $41 million bond that could address some of these critical infrastructure needs, at least for the next couple of years, and help us especially continue on with the street resurfacing. Patty, did you have some ideas on, well, what could be the debt service on like a $40 million?
I knew you were going to
Fine.
ask me that, and I'm sorry I did not get to that number today, but I will email it
Take a
to you.
guess.
I apologize. Take a guess. I don't know, 2 million? I don't know. It really depends on...
Let's just use that for illustration
Okay.
purposes. Because not all things look as rosy as they may seem. What you've got to make sure is whatever the debt service is going to be, that has to be funded. And right now, I don't think you or I can foresee in our current revenue and expenditure projections $2 million that is there available right now to pay that kind of debt service. So keep that in mind. So this looks great, but we've also got to work on where's the revenue going to come from, especially when you look at kind of the projections on the looming operating general fund gap in revenue versus expenditures. But we thought this would be helpful. I would strongly recommend that at least in your discussion tonight, in the meetings ahead, you give some consideration to a infrastructure bond. I think there's too many critical issues. We haven't even spent time tonight to refresh your memory on how much was recommended to be spent in facilities. I think that was, about $25 to $30 million over about
million.
5 years. Stormwater and sanitary sewer, we were up to $130 million. The fire stations alone, by the time we remodeled 3 stations and that, could be 10, 12 million. Now, again, we're only looking at this, but but you have to start somewhere. And what I continue to hear from you is that we've got to keep that priority on street resurfacing, the underground utility work associated with that, and we've got to continue on. Also keep in mind that nothing in here includes recommendations that's forthcoming from the Brick Street Master Plan. Those aren't built in. Next week we'll be talking about the Streets Master Plan and other big projects, and then ultimately the downtown streetscape. Let's finish off coming back to sanitary sewer rates and stormwater rates, Patty, because I know you have some information. Let's just kind of give some idea of where are we on current rates. And I will say this, I think we have changed our view and opinion on what was presented, I think maybe 6 months ago, on the sanitary sewer and stormwater rate study. I think what was brought to you at that time was a rate increase that was insufficient. Upon further reflection, further analysis, I think it is not going to be adequate to even address some of our critical needs in stormwater and sanitary sewer in the next 5 years. So I think if anything, we feel that we need to be looking at probably something more substantial in the way of a rate increase, possibly even to the point of maybe doubling those rates in a phased-in approach, maybe over 4 or 5 years. Could you kind of pick it up from there?
Yes. The reason that, we're all thinking about this right now is certainly because of some of the actions that Normal has taken recently, where they really are doubling their sewer rate over, a 5 to 6 year period. They're also doubling not just their usage rate, but their fixed rate. And what you have here that we handed out was actually an exhibit that was made by Jim and Michael Hill that I'd asked them to get into detail for, but and I don't have it for the projector, I apologize, but on the right side is the average residential bill here in Bloomington. It's about 500 cubic feet. I apologize, I don't have it for exhibit, but do you want to talk them through this exhibit quickly, and I can pick back up on
Absolutely. So, Mayor and City Council, the item that you have before you, the sheet that we put together, was dealing with historically, where have we been and where would we be if we implemented some of the rate increases that recently the town of Normal have done? What if we just matched exactly what they did? So that's what you see before you. You can see on the left side, for those who have it here, if we were to implement that May 1st of 2019, there's a couple things. We have there's two pieces to any sewer rate. You have a usage and you have a fixed usage charge, like a fixed monthly charge. And so ours is woefully low right now. It's under half of what of a lot of other communities are. We're suggesting bringing that right in line with where the town of Normal would be at. And then in addition, that average usage rate would also then increase. You can see where that bill would be for most residences. It would be a slow, progressive, phased-in process. That would help. That would really be able to help. It'd be something that would be a quick decision as a council we could make that would help get us a little bit further with some of our sewer televising. I'll say it definitively, though, it would not get us all the way, as City Manager Hales indicated. It really wouldn't. But it would make a very strong difference in the upcoming years to position us to at least get a handle on the entire problem. What I'll say is that you know how strongly Public Works we feel about rating everything and providing objective recommendations to you as a council. We still are only 13% along with our televising and rating of our sanitary sewers. That is the worst infrastructure item that we have that we really have a good handle on. That's one of the key and most important things for us to have a handle on. Right now, we're not, Chief Moore, not to put into, but we're playing fireman right now with putting out, being reactive instead of proactive. To give you an example, if you had 1 point repair in a street, that's on average about $12,000. For $12,000 for the 1 point failure when you see a cave-in, we could line sanitary sewer, we could line that entire public sanitary sewer. And so it is so much more cost effective to be proactive rather than reactive.
Alderman Burgess.
Can we put some numbers on that? Because I think when we talk about doubling rates, I think that is a very scary way to put it, because it sounds like a very extreme solution, but we're really not talking about, because the numbers are already relatively low, we're not talking about monumental changes. So,
Correct.
for example, on the chart that we can see, but it's not up there, what we're talking about is moving from an average residential bill of $9.50 to, if we follow this model, to a bill that would be $15.75 by 2023.
Correct. So initially what we'd be looking at is going, just as Alderman Burgess talked about, we would be going from $9.50 for an average user to $11.60 May 1st of 2018. And that would incrementally increase over time. But again, this isn't something that would happen overnight. We do believe that a phased approach is easier for residents. People understand your price of things go up, and we really do believe that a lot of our citizens have a strong understanding of the need of our infrastructure. When we talk about Streets 2.0 or more investment in streets, you cannot neglect the water mains, the storm water, the sanitary sewer underneath the streets, in addition to the 59 miles of our creeks and our 73 public detention basins as well, that currently there's no maintenance happening on those.
Can I add one just follow-up to that? And I would disagree with you in part. I think, one, residents do understand that we have a serious problem with infrastructure, and I think it's because we've been very vocal in sharing that information with all these master plans. But I will say this, I think the successful approach in working with our ratepayers and those who are going to ultimately pay the bill is saying, if we do nothing, what can we accomplish in the way of utility improvements? And be specific with it. If we raise the rates, maybe a modest amount or doubling, what more can we do? And in my mind, in other cities, as you start to share that with residents, then they can also share back their opinions with us. We can be very aggressive, but it comes at a cost, or we can be less aggressive and kind of a moderate approach, but we're very specific on what we're going to accomplish, but also what we are not going to accomplish. And I think that's a key to any rate increase. We start with probably task force, ad hoc committees to validate that. We go out to the residents, help them, because keep in mind, we're talking about two different fees. And when you look at this, when I came in January 2009, $3.40. That was what the average household was paying for sanitary sewer. But since that time, they've only been paying, $4 for stormwater. And that hasn't changed. But I think we need to keep making sure they understand, for that, what are you going to get? And the more we can continue to relate that and show them, and then over every year, continue to update them and what we're accomplishing, how many more miles of improvements and sanitary sewer lining we're able to accomplish, et cetera. That's got to be a constant to make sure they'll support us. And who knows, maybe in 5-6 years we find out that revenue is just not sufficient. But thanks.
Alderman Burgess.
Thank you. And that's a really good point, David, because I can share the residents in my ward who are directly affected by some of these issues that are being caused by the lack of funding. So people who have detention basins that have received little to no maintenance, people who have issues with sump pump drains, and we've completely eliminated all funding for that.
Sure.
Those people are calling me and emailing me and saying, when are you taking action on this? And in advance of today's meeting, I actually went back and watched the work session where we last discussed this, which was on December 14th, 2015, which was a little while ago. And I'm honestly, as a council member, I'm a little bit embarrassed that I have not continued to bring this up and discuss this. So I apologize for that, because we've got to squarely address this issue. But one thing, first of all, I recommend all the council members to watch that meeting and familiarize yourself with the scope of the issues, because Jim is underselling it right now. But one
Don't
of the
have the
things-
time.
yeah, I know you don't have the time, and we went into great detail there. But one of the things I thought that was really hit home for me is that this notion that it is better for our residents to keep these prices low is perhaps not accurate, because there is a price we pay as a community by not maintaining our infrastructure, and that is that our emergency repairs are exponentially more expensive than our proactive actions. Can you give us do you have an example of that?
Absolutely. I think of those council members who've been on a few years, you might remember the Douglas Street IMEV hole. We had we dubbed it that internally because the hole in the sewer, it was a 60-inch sewer. The hole on the side of the sewer was large enough you could fit one of those small electric vehicles. You could shove it in there and fit it in there. That was that large of a hole. And it was a very descriptive, wonderful example. What that cost, the cost of that repair actually would have allowed us to line that entire street from East to Prairie. And so that was $134,000. It cost us $2,300, almost $400, $2,400 per lineal foot for the cost to repair that, just to repair 2-point repairs. For $135 a foot, we would be able to line that entire sewer. It is such easy dollars to understand anytime that you have that. And like I said, I think I already used the example of about $12,000 to do a single point repair on an 8-inch. And that allows you to line 500 feet, which is around an average block. You have a 380 feet to 500 foot block is pretty standard. So, but the point is, exactly like Alderman Berg has said, It's not just about the emergency response. Economic development, we have put a high priority in this community on the need to keep driving forward with economic development. Our streets matter. We've talked about the importance of streets, but you cannot neglect what's underneath of it. Whenever I started, one of the biggest things would blow people's mind is you put new asphalt down, and within the next year you come and dig it up to take care of the sewers underneath. We are getting to the point in this community, because we've been talking about this for so many years, our staff is struggling to find the streets we can resurface without needing sanitary sewer work. It is very difficult as a staff that we have it televised and the sanitary sewer work done. We've been talking about this for years. Many of you have heard me beat this drum very hard, and it's time we really need some action, or we're getting to beyond the crisis point. Now we have to really be funding it to catch up, and that's where we're at. I'm going to put this on a flash drive so I can put that one example on the screen for you.
Meanwhile, Alderman Bray.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for your discussion on this, and Patty Lynn, thank you as well. You made a statement that if we follow this kind of a model, that this will make a dent, but this won't quite do it.
Accurate.
Is
City
there a
manager
number?
said that accurately.
Is there a number that would do it?
The city manager is correct in that, he had pointed out that being more aggressive. Originally, we had looked at some numbers, and we were going to be more aggressive with our sewers, because we knew that we were behind with our overall resurfacing. We knew that streets were what people cared about, but we were needing a much quicker. As I recall, we were looking at 30%, right away every year for multiple years was one of our last mechanisms we were looking at, and we had to. And that would get us to the point where we were double our current rates. We need to revisit that, of course. We have to make sure, as the city manager pointed out, we've got to revisit some of those numbers. But you can be phased in. You can also be more aggressive. As a city, where do we need to go? We just can't be behind where we are resurfacing without doing that underground work.
If I can, this also allows me to kind of add this other is, part of tonight's discussion is to get some direction from the council, because again, it's the easiest thing we can do is bring you that status quo CIP, have you adopt it next Monday, but hopefully no one's ready to do that. I do think that what you need to do at a very high level is give us some direction, because we could always come back and say, what about a 50% increase or a 100% increase? And then Jim and the engineers will put together and say, all right, now that we know that, we can put together a 5-year plan, and he can come back here and show you what we can accomplish in that 5 years, but also what we can't accomplish in that 5 years. But I think we've all got to keep in mind, it took not decades, but probably half century to get to where we are today. We're not going to get out of it in 5 years, 10 years, or even 20 years, but that's what we're hoping either from tonight's discussion or in the next couple of weeks, is give us some of that high-level direction, and then we'll come back and put the details so that you can say, all right, I either feel comfortable about those projects over the next 5 years, or that's not aggressive, as I compare the master plan with the 5 years and things like that. And that's, I think, where you're going to ultimately come to your comfort level as to what it's going to take in the way of some tough decisions on fees and what we want to sell to the citizenry about what they're going to get, on a couple of scenarios on fee increases.
The city manager is correct. What we really need is we need 5 years. We just need to know a communication plan, something out there so citizens can know what we are going to be doing. And staff that also allows our own streets and sewers crews to partner well moving forward. It allows everything to integrate. Right now, it's a year-to-year issue, and that becomes crisis management as opposed to proactive planning.
I think Alderman Bray's question is a critical question. What does that look like if we're, fully funded, and maybe getting that kind of information back will help us decide where we settle, particularly in view of our growing structural deficit and how we manage that. Alderman Wallenboy.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, so I have several questions. Well, not just you. I mean, Paddling, if you want to jump in, sure.
I'll gladly defer.
Yeah. Oh. That was your song, huh?
So I remember the last time we talked about sewer rate, the study we talked about. Eh, My impression, this was a while ago, so my impression was that the rate increase was over a much longer period of time as opposed to what we have in front of us.
It was a 5-year with an ongoing recommendation. One thing we've talked about is, one thing the city has not done well is a continuation, small incremental increases. Once we get to a fair level, we forget about it. And the next elected body might come in and it's just fine until it comes to another crisis point. It's so much easier for residents when the cost of bread goes up or milk goes up, the cost goes up 3%. We know the costs are going to continue to go up. If we had done that with our storm sewer fund, it actually would be an interesting number to run. Back in 2004 when it was created, if we had implemented an automatic 3% increase, would we be in the same shape that we're in? We would definitely not be as critical as we are now. So what the last recommendation held was that once we get to the level where we need to be, the service level, there's an ongoing small increment that then allows us to revisit it every 5 years, but it doesn't allow us to get to a crisis point like we are.
Okay, thank you, because that's one of the things that I was also thinking about, because I know, many other, bodies and institutions and groups have a reserve fund, that they
That would be
build
great.
over time, so that they can avoid this sort of crisis situation. I just, I don't know how we got to this point, but I think it will be something that we need to explore in the future, because I think it does set the expectation, of what we want to do. Residents kind of know. I mean, this is just like a house. We have to find a way to fix it and not, as we go, and not wait until there is a major crisis in order to do that.
Thank you.
Alderman, if I could say, the answer is simple. Even before the Great Recession, what we were doing is for decades, the city was, as Carson Bice said in his infamous report, we were subsidizing residential development and being the banker instead of doing what we should have done, and that is paying attention to in reinvesting into our existing utilities. That is cut and dried, and it goes back to the Carson report, and and that's in major why, not only did we spend what we had in reserve, when I got here, the sanitary sewer fund was $6 million in the red. Stormwater fund was $2 million in the red. We were spending money we didn't even have to help new development pay for utility extensions.
Thank you for that sad reminder, David.
Yeah.
No, but seriously.
You wish I would have kept my mouth shut,
No,
right?
no, I think it's really important for us to understand how did
How
we
we
get
get-
there. It was
okay, yeah,
a philosophical decision, a policy decision that was made, and we've had to 180 that one, and we're pulling ourselves out of it.
So with that said, then I'd be really curious to see what those numbers would look like, over a longer period of time, but taking into consideration that we want to build up a reserve fund that allows us to address issues as they come up, rather than having this crisis situation every so often, like you've talked about. That's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to address was the issue of capacity. I know we've talked about that in terms of streets, but if we get more aggressive, do we have the capacity locally to be able to address that, all those issues that we have to address?
Streets, sewers, or just streets?
Even sewers, because we've
Okay.
talked about it in the context of streets.
Okay.
And I was curious whether or not we have the capacity to be more aggressive locally.
With streets, we've talked about that. When you start getting past that $8 million a year mark, it gets to be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult for local contractors to be able to meet that. And so that's one piece. And the sewers actually, all of the vendors, there's a lot more vendors for lining and televising. If we have to break those kind of contracts up, that's actually fairly easy for us to do. The difficulty with streets is the limited source where we can get our hot asphalt to be able to, and we've broken up contracts, you see. So each different piece of infrastructure has some other some other constraints, but streets is really what would be what we have a ceiling on. Sewers, there is not. Even if we take the recommended $3.25 million of lining a year, that's what the master plan it indicates we should do. 1% of our sewers, 4 miles of sewer a year, is what it recommends. This year we're doing less than 1 mile of sewer lining. That's not a capacity. There's I think last time I recall 6 vendors that bid on sewer lining. So there's plenty that would come into this community. So that's not the issue for us. But it's a great question.
Good. And then last thing is, I know this is all based on water consumption, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So as we double rates or change rates, are we taking into consideration the fact that people might make adjustments as well to their consumption?
True. And
impact
Bob
our
Yale,
revenues.
the water director, has also commented over time, low flow fixtures, some of the changes in usage has affected everybody in his industry and thereby also affected the sanitary sewer usage fees really from the mid 2000s until now. You started seeing more of this trend, and so that does affect us. And so that's why rates also have to be increased to be able to account for the fact that you change things like the fixed monthly charge. That's one thing that is outside of your usage, and that's why that is one piece of the puzzle. But again, those are what rate studies have to take into account, and ours did when we utilized Raftillis.
Alderman Matthey.
So just to keep things in perspective, one of the things I wanted to point out is I read an article that said Comcast has raised their rates for basic cable and has outpaced inflation on average of 60-something% over the last decade. So, people are willing to pay for basic cable, but maybe, have we ever asked them, are they willing to not have their sewer back up into their house? I mean, when we're looking at things like that, it's just keeping things in perspective. And I just want to bring up that one of the things that continues to bother me is when you do your presentations and you talk about the stormwater overflow system, and putting bad things back into the water system in the United States. I mean, I'm always a little bothered about that, so I definitely want to keep our attention on fixing that problem, making that go away, right? And also, something I think we have to keep in mind too is a lot of parts of our older neighborhoods, we are actually causing depression of property values because there's a perception that if you live in newer neighborhoods, those neighborhoods don't have the same issues. They don't have sewer issues. They don't have water issues. They might have newer roads. They have curbs. They have sidewalks. So every time we ignore fixing the older neighborhoods, we're creating artificial depression of the property values in those neighbors. We're effectively telling people we don't value these older neighborhoods. You should move out to the east side, which then we just heard Chief Moore presenting to us that he's having issues. We've heard Chief Hefner say he's having issues providing service out there. So the decisions that we're making are causing those property value issues, and of course that affects the revenues we have as a council when we're trying to figure out budget allocations. It's all tied together. My last thought is, I would like us to see us end up with a solution where these rates, when we're looking at once we get caught up. We get caught up with our sanitary sewer rates. We get caught up with our water rates because water departments have the exact same issue. Looking at a system where we're tying them to the inflation rate of Illinois. I mean, we know what the inflation rate is in central Illinois. It's published by the state. Maybe we need to look at a long-term system where there's automatic increases if inflation goes up. Everything goes up because, I think somebody pointed out, it's happening in everything else that we do. And, the cost of milk and bread goes up, everything gets more expensive. So I think we need to put a long-term solution in place so that we stop having emergency situations. Thanks.
Alderman Sage.
Thank you. And Jamie, I wasn't going to say anything, but this, I think perhaps will segue in later to the conversation about priority-based budgeting. It's okay to ask our residents, you know, why are you not willing to pay to not have sewers back up in your house? But residents then have the right to say, City Council, what are you doing to reduce expenses elsewhere in order to reallocate money into these core services? That's just as fair a question, if probably a not more pertinent question to ask.
Absolutely.
And so, again, and I've had this conversation for, I think, almost the 10 years I've been here, right? The essence of priority-based budgeting is to reflect the conversations that people have around their kitchen tables all the time, and that is, when I have more month than I have money, what am I going to quit spending on so that I'm able to, you know, pay for those core things I want, like mortgage, utilities, those types of things. That may mean that I go from 2 cars to 1 car, or I only eat out once a week. Those nice to haves that we heard referred to in public comment, that's the problem. Until we're able to embrace the heavy lifting associated with priority budgeting, then we're going to continue to have these conversations going forward.
David, what do you need from us, and when do you need it?
Yeah, what I'd like to maybe just see if there's general support. What we'd like to do is bring back a 5-year projection of what we could do if, and we're going to start with sanitary sewer and stormwater fees, if we were to look at, say, 100% increase, but phase it in. What exactly could we do in 5 years? What could we not do? So at least you have an illustration to see what could that do in moving us towards trying to work on those deferred capital. I think that's at least a start. You're not saying you're going to approve it or anything else, but I think that'll begin to give you in that area. Now, keep in mind, and well, let me just say is at least if we bring back that for further discussion in the work session, could that be a starting point?
And
for the
that would
council.
be for August 28th you're looking at?
I'm not sure.
Whatever the count,
It's going to be dependent on when they can have it ready, but I don't know if it's the 28th, if they have it, or definitely by the first meeting in September. We do want to continue to move this along.
Not trying to put undue pressure on, I just didn't know how quickly you could turn that around.
So, and the other thing I do want to indicate to you, we're also going to bring back some recommendations how to address the non-enterprise fund projects. Because when we look at general tax revenue, fire stations, parks, you know, some of the facilities, things like that, there's no dedicated revenue source. And that's not going to be too easy, but we'd like to start bringing to you a couple of options to consider. Because unfortunately, it's usually the general tax revenue that is going to support operating expenses in the general fund. But there is some ways many cities have done, just like with the enterprise fund, to have a dedicated revenue source to help fund those. We could do the same in the general fund. But we'd at least like to start that discussion with you because, a bond is great, but how you're going to pay for it and things like that. So if there's no opposition, at least I think that's a starting point. So unless the council says no, we'd like to come back to you with that.
Alderman Black.
Thank you. In my time here, I've noticed that when we have these types of challenges, we often creep up on these sorts of solutions. Mm-hmm. It'd be nice to see, and I think we were kind of talking about a little bit ago, is what is a fully funded, what do those fees actually look like? And then if we scale it back, then it's on us.
Right.
So I'm thinking more of let's see what it would cost, and then we can talk about is that tenable, and then where do we have those other cuts, and where do we have that expense management to kind of fill in those gaps or appropriately adjust it, as opposed to trying to just figure it out and see where it gets us. Because then I'm just picturing us a conversation amongst a group like this 5 years from now. Why do they do it that way?
Right.
I don't ever want to be.
I would support that. I agree with that. I'd like to see that, the all in, and then, begin to
Right, because
think about it.
I'd be remiss. I know we're talking about a lot of really important things here. O'Neill Pool, very important to West Bloomington. Wave pool, make it a destination.
Any additional feedback for David on Alderman Black? Yes?
All right.
Okay, so we'll call it the
All
Black
right.
proposal.
Okay, all right, we'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
And now the icing on the cake, our next and final topic for the night, if Melissa
Yeah.
is coming forward. There's a reason for our madness and how we put these together. And and of course, Alderman Sage had mentioned this, and I do want to throw this out. Time and time again, I think studies across the nation have demonstrated to me that when you look to the electorate and where their threshold is on how much taxes they want to pay, I think too often they're saying, hey, I'm already drowning in federal, state, and local taxes. They're saying that enough's enough, and we've seen what's happened in the last 6 or 8 years because of that. As I've continued as I talk with city managers, as we see what other cities are doing, they are also trying to come up with that long-term financial sustainability plan because they know they can never raise enough revenue to pay for everything they'd like to. And time again, there's this constant desire to go back, well, maybe we need to refocus on our core mission. Maybe we need to really focus on the highest priorities. And a modified version of priority-based budgeting is, I think, a key. But I think it's also the toughest for elected officials ultimately to commit to. So last but not least, what we see as a tool to help in making incremental decisions, on an ongoing basis. Isn't just one time, it's every year. And it's every year for many years to come. So Melissa, if you just kind of go through this brief presentation on where we stand on priority-based budgeting and what's coming forward in the months ahead.
Yes, we have saved the best for last, and I'll try to keep it within my 15 minutes. So I'd like to provide just a general overview and really talk about the importance of priority-based budgeting and also kind of go through what we've accomplished so far and what we plan to do moving forward. And some of this may seem like a review of information that I've previously discussed or sent to you, but I thought it was the perfect time to kind of revisit and review as we're moving into the budget season, as well as kind of getting closer to that strategic planning time for the council. So the first thing I wanted to do was just to define what is priority-based budgeting. So I've provided you with the standard definition as provided by the Government Finance Officers Association. And as you can see, the priority-driven approach is really to provide a strategic budget process that really reflects the community values and helps to ensure that the residents still receive a high level of services with the limited resources available. And the City of Bloomington began to look at this initiative back in 2014, and I'm really hoping that now we can kind of get some momentum with it moving forward and really start to reinvigorate that initiative, because priority-based budgeting is really becoming increasingly a best practice within local government sectors, and the Illinois County Managers Association has declared it a leading practice amongst government management. So we want to be on that cutting edge. So why is priority-based budgeting so important? And as you've kind of heard over and over tonight, we may be looking at addressing this projected structural deficit in the general fund that could reach to over $6 million by the year 2022. And these projections were done prior to the approval of the state budget, so this is not even including that additional fee that they will be costing us. So with the flat revenue growth and just the increasing cost to provide city services, priority-based budgeting will help provide kind of that common sense strategic alternative to incremental budgeting. So I think in general, kind of the traditional government budgeting is just every year you kind of add that percentage to each budget, you add a program or you add initiatives, or you remove programs or initiatives if that's a factor, without really looking and addressing whether or not those programs and initiatives are helping to achieve the desired priority results of the community. So that's really what we want to start to focus on. And by using the priority approach, with that approach, you're first starting with what are your desired results for the next year. What are those priorities that you want to achieve? So you begin there, and then from there start to allocate the resources. And this is really no different, as Alderman Sage mentioned, how a lot of people, kind of budget in your home. If your priority is to purchase a new home and you need to save for a down payment, you might start to allocate more to your savings to save for that, and less to, say, maybe transportation. Maybe that means utilizing public transportation. Maybe that means riding your bike. Maybe that means carpooling. So just kind of looking at allocating fewer resources maybe to that portion of your budget. So in establishing this prioritization is just one of the many benefits of priority-based budgeting, and I've just listed a few here. But kind of setting out that desired priority result will really set the stage for the course of the year and kind of be the overarching objective of the organization and what you're trying to achieve. And also will provide the alignment of resources. And providing that alignment of resources will also provide an opportunity to have those meaningful discussions about what programs are mandated, what are we required to provide, what programs possibly you could look at for increase in user fee, as we just discussed, what programs would be appropriate to possibly provide through a partnership, what other service providers are maybe be providing those services. Are there duplications of programs within the organization? Looking at that as well. And then initially, do we have the resources to add new initiatives? So that comes into play as well. It will help to provide increased transparency and citizen engagement as we go through that prioritization and talking about what are the priorities of the community, as well as providing additional accountability, because a component of the priority-based budgeting is to have those performance metrics with each of those programs. So as we move forward, we'll be able to show the resources that were allocated to that program, and then providing that accountability of performance measures, and are we achieving the results that we want to achieve. So this is kind of just a standard priority-based budgeting process. It's a very flexible and customizable process. This is just the standard kind of 5 steps that most organizations utilize as they're moving into a priority-based budgeting. So the first one, as I said, is to really determine those priorities. What are those desired results we're trying to achieve? And then once the priorities have been identified, we have to start to begin to define what those priority results look like. And I think kind of the easiest way to explain that is when the city does blank, then that desired result is achieved. And so we kind of already do that in the strategic plan, where we outline what the priority is and then list those objectives. The next step is to really identify the programs, and by differentiating between programs instead of just viewing it and comparing department to department, we really provide more of a holistic approach, and I think it really helps create more of a better understanding of what the city is really providing and what those programs are. Once the programs have been identified, values are placed upon those based on the priority results you hope to achieve, and then finally resources are allocated to each of those individual programs. And so I just wanted to provide an example of why this process is so important. We currently have a lot of priorities to consider. We've got the strategic plan, the comprehensive plan, the Council 5 priorities. So we have a lot of different priorities that we're currently looking at. And I think one priority that's seen through all of those is public safety. And I think when most people hear public safety, you think police, you think fire, it's for public safety. But we also have other programs within the city that also affect public safety, one of those being in community development building inspections. And one of the services provided in building inspections is the fire inspections. Currently, we have about 3,300 inspections that should be completed annually, according to our code. But they've only been allocated enough resources to have 2 fire inspectors, and with the resources that they have, they are only able to complete about 2,100 of those inspections a year. So it kind of brings us back to that question of, in our list of priorities, how important is public safety, and do we want to allocate more resources to that program, or do we want to allocate resources to other programs? In addition to just those 2,100 inspections, they also have additional inspections they have to complete. They have complaint-driven inspections as well as inspections for special events. So if there's any event that's going to be using fireworks, whether it be at the arena or some other facility, they do have to be involved in those as well. So then those add additional to those 3,300 that they have to do. And I know that they are prioritizing, those facilities that have the most public safety. They are prioritizing those to make sure that those inspections are completed. But once again, they just don't have the resources to complete all of those on an annual basis.
Melissa, and if I could just interject, and I use the term modified PBB process because one other area that we want to incorporate into this process, and I want to use it in this example, is we are also going to be looking at how is that program currently funded. Is it funded by general tax revenue, which this is? So currently, general tax revenue fully funds these 2 FTE positions. But what we're going to be looking at, too, is this a service that is deriving maybe a private benefit or benefiting only a select few, or should a fee maybe be considered? We have rental inspection fees that cover, I think, about 100% of the FTE positions. This is a situation where, as we continue to look throughout, should at least a fee be considered? At least the council will know, here's how it's currently being funded. Is there other options or other ways that cities have come to fund the fire inspection program? And what are those other alternatives? And do they involve a fee that, again, you could relieve the tax burden on the general taxpayer to consider these and other programs we'll look at? So that's kind of another modified aspect to what we're going to be doing, is adding that particular element. So
I just really quickly want to go through accomplishments, which I talked about previously at the Saturday budget work session back in March. But thanks to the directors and their staff and all their hard work, so far we've been able to identify about 160 total programs. And that could change as we go back and review and revise. That could increase, that could decrease. But we will be going through to make sure that we've got consistency among the departments and how we're defining those programs. We've also been able to go through and look at mandates and priority levels and service levels of what's being provided for each program. For resource allocation, so far we've just done estimates, but we will be going back to look at the actual true cost of each of those programs, talking about direct cost, indirect cost for each of those programs as well, and including the amount of general fund subsidy that each department receives. Last year, we had each of the directors go through and provide some proposed improvement plans, including resources and what impact that would have on service levels. So we'll be going back to revise some of those as we look at, did they receive those resources? Are there new resources for new initiatives or new items that they need moving forward? And also performance metrics. We did start last year at looking at performance metrics, but once again, with moving forward with our next steps, that's one of the things as well that we'll be looking to really go through and define what are the performance metrics for each of those programs, how are we measuring that, and providing more of a cascading performance management system throughout the city. So as we're moving forward, as I said, we're going to be kind of reviewing and revising that program inventory. We want to make sure that we're going through and providing documentation for all of those mandates. So if it's a state or federal mandate, or is it a city mandate? Is it something we're mandating upon ourselves? Is it something we want to continue to mandate? Is it maybe a best practice? Maybe there's a national standard that we want to achieve. We want to be at that level. So we'll be looking at that as well. And then, as I said, determining actual cost. And moving forward with the increased citizen engagement, my hope is that down the road, I mean, this is going to be quite a lengthy process that's going to take staff some time to really work through to get it completed and up and running. But my hope is that down the road we'll be able to have some sort of online tool that we can increase that citizen engagement, so citizens will be able to go on every year when we start talking about priorities for the upcoming budget year and really provide that citizen input and feedback to the city as well. So that's my hope as we move forward. And with the next round of priority-based budgeting that's going out to staff here in the next few weeks, we'll be looking at some additional factors. As the city manager mentioned, we'll be looking at how are those programs funded? Are they generating any revenue? Is it completely covering the entire cost of the program? We're also going to be looking at the percentage of the community that receives that service. So I think that's another thing that will factor into that user fee. When we're looking at the percentage of community being served, is it the entire community? Is it the entire county? Is it only a small portion? Looking to some of those additional factors as well, and then we'll be bringing that back.
Thank you.
So any
questions or comments? I want to thank you for your the priority-based budget briefs that you send out, and kind of chunk that out, and yeah. I appreciate those.
I hope that's been helpful. Yes, I'm trying to keep it brief, but as I said, I know some of it's just kind of, I just keep, but I think as you kind of hear those concepts and terms, and I think is to kind of have that repetitive nature of it as we get more into more of a practical application is helpful. So
yeah, that's be good information for some tough choices we have to make, so I appreciate it. All right. I believe we are done. All right. Is there a motion to adjourn? Thank you. Is there a second? Oh, okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Have a good evening.
I second.
Diana. Yeah, sorry.